Thank you everyone for coming to our second virtual ACC Writer Studio event, and I'm happy to see lots of faces I know. This is our last Writer Studio event of the semester, and we don't know exactly what the fall will bring, but we'll keep having events regardless. When the in-person semester was canceled, we did have some events that we had planned, and we ended up scrapping them for various reasons. And one thing I thought of were two friends of mine whose books were being published at that time, and how difficult it must be to launch a book or a book tour while one is supposed to be, you know, isolating and staying at home. And so both Kathy and DJ are two wonderful nonfiction writers, friends, former colleagues, and mentors. And their books have some commonalities. I mean, I think they're quite different, but certainly the importance of nature, observation, history, natural history, and the role of family and discovery of self. So I thought this just seemed like a natural pairing to have you two read together. And I'm so happy to see many former colleagues and friends all together, along with current colleagues and friends all together on the Zoom. So Debbie, I believe, is going to read first. Each DJ and Kathy are going to each read a section. They're going to introduce their work a little bit. I know many of you are familiar with it. And then afterwards we'll have a Q&A, and then in the chat also are links to if you'd like to purchase the book. So you can even purchase it while they're reading, or you may want to wait. I know some people have a book on its way to them. And I guess if you have a question, you can, the chat is open right now. I'll shut it down if necessary, but if you do have a question while they're reading, you could put that question in the chat, and then we'll address it during the Q&A. And then just a reminder for everybody, it looks like everybody does have their microphone muted, but to please mute, especially during the reading. And then I think the chats are probably the best way to ask questions, at least, you know, during the reading. And then, I mean, if people want to, I don't know, we can figure out the microphone situation afterwards. So sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Andrea Mason. I co-lead the Visiting Writer Series Writer Studio at ACC, along with Jamey Trotter. He's here somewhere. And here is DJ Lee. DJ Lee is Regents Professor of Literature and Creative Writing at Washington State University. Her creative work includes over 30 nonfiction pieces in magazines and anthologies. She has published 8 books on literature, history, and the environment. Most recently, The Land Speaks, New Voices at the Intersection of Oral and Environmental History. Lee is director of the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness History Project and a scholar fellow at the Black Earth Institute. Please join me in welcoming DJ Lee.
There. This is my book, Remote, Finding Home in the Bitterroot. And if you guys don't know where the Bitterroots are, the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness straddles the Montana-Idaho border in the Northern Rocky Mountains. And that's mostly where the book is set. I'm actually going to read from a manuscript version because the chapter that I'm going to read is it's chapter 24 out of 34 chapters. Each chapter has a black and white photograph. I just wanted to let you know that. And then the photographs in some sense illustrate the chapters, but they also, if you line them all up side by side, they also tell their own narrative, complementary narrative. So I cut some of this chapter so that it would fit within a shorter time frame. It's about 13 minutes. This chapter takes place the summer that I was a volunteer at a place called Moose Creek Ranger Station, which is in the middle of this 1.3 million acre wilderness. I took the position because my grandparents had lived there from the 1920s to the 1940s. The book is mainly about my search for my ancestry, but also my search for, you know, kind of my own identity, and also to come to terms with this vast landscape that I did not know anything about until I was in my late 30s. One of the things that I'm trying to figure out in this particular chapter is my grandmother's mental illness. A few things that you need to know as I start this chapter is that I call my grandmother Esther throughout the book. She used to say, "My name's not Grandma, it's Esther." She liked to be called Esther, so that's what we called her. The other thing that you need to know is that there's a character in here named Gabe, and he is the mule skinner at this remote ranger station. He was in his early 30s at the time, and I was in my early 40s. So we're at this remote ranger station, 25 miles from the nearest dirt road, and I'm a real newbie at this point. One morning, Gabe pushed a pile of Western Mule magazines at me. "If you want to learn about the wilderness," he said. Each issue featured one of the hairy beasts on its cover. "Not exactly Vogue models," I said. Gabe didn't seem amused. "There's a myth about mules being stubborn," he said, raising earnest eyebrows. "But what they've really got is a strong sense of self-preservation. They don't let go of the past. A mule, once something bad happens, it's always bad. If a mule gets stuck in a bog, she'll remember that for the rest of her life, and you might never get her over a boggy trail again. A horse? You can coax a horse over a bog 1,000,000 times." He told me that mules carry mental baggage. Mental baggage. The phrase has stayed with me, probably because I have, in the years since that summer at Moose Creek, learned more about Esther's struggles to let go of the past. After she spent a few months in the mental ward of the hospital, she seemed to get better. Ate full meals, slept regular hours, attended community gatherings in their small town of St. Mary's, Idaho. Gradually, though, she crawled into bed again, refused to eat, grew bone thin. But she did read Christian Science literature and made marginal notes. When I noticed she had underlined the passage, "To believe in death involves a temporary loss of God," in her Mary Baker Eddy volumes, I knew I was witnessing the dark silver glow of despair that comes before a full fall into depression. When Esther went to bed a second time, my grandfather didn't know what to do. He knew of a Christian Science hospital in Puyallup, hundreds of miles from St. Mary's. The hospital was expensive, but the mystical language of Christian Science spoke to Esther as nothing else did. To get her into that place, my mother told me once, Dad pooled his pension checks with my teenage savings. What did my grandfather think? If I had to guess, I'd say Esther's mulishness, her inability to let go of the past, was part of what attracted him to her in the first place. He had a special affinity for mules, an aspect of him I didn't understand until that summer at Moose Creek. I perused the stack of Western Mule magazines as Gabe continued to make breakfast. The wilderness trails were made by mules for mules, he said. You think any other animal could walk these mountains with so much on its back? He had a point. I had often stopped at the corral to watch the mastiff creatures cock their ears, snort, and swat flies with their tails. I knew I could never handle such a large animal, and I wouldn't walk within even 10 feet of the corral. Yet I was strangely attracted to the mules, to Tank in particular, taller than the rest with large hooves and a sleek black coat. Whenever I walked by, always keeping my distance, Tank snorted, raised his tail, and pawed the ground as if he were ready to run away with me. A few days later, Gabe said, "I need you today." The fences around the pasture were broken. The elk had cracked them to feed on the rich grasses that were reserved for the horses. So the elk corral is on one side of this station, and just need to tell you that the horse pasture is on the other. They're probably like 200 feet apart. We got to working digging new post holes for the horse pasture and rebuilding the entire fence with hammers and saws and rusty nails until 6 hours later, Gabe stretched his back and wiped his brow with a handkerchief. "I'm packing out tomorrow," he said, taking a long drink from his water bottle. He wiggled the fence. It barely budged. "This is strong enough to keep out anything," he said. That night, exhausted and satisfied, I lit the propane lanterns in the ranger's house. Cool night air and the seesaw rhythm of the crickets filtered through the screen door. I sank into the rocking chair and closed my eyes. A few minutes later, a large crash startled me. I flung open the door to a ceiling of stars and a waxing crescent moon. Dark shapes were moving on the airfield. My eyes adjusted. Mules. Every evening when the bush planes stopped landing, Gabe released the mule team onto the airstrip to graze, and at dawn he ushered them into the corral. I was admiring their forms when the crash sounded again, and then I realized with sudden horror what was happening. I slipped into my shoes, grabbed my headlamp, and ran down the field a quarter mile, stumbling at the hooves of Tank, who was ready to spring forward into the fence Gabe and I had spent all day mending. Several other mules were gathered behind him like a cheering section. Scrambling to my feet and backing away, I screamed, "Tank, no!" He swished his tail and froze. Maybe I did have authority over these giants. But when I turned to walk back up the airfield, I heard another splinter. Tank and I locked eyes. He turned his head, ears cocked back in annoyance, and slammed into the fence again. What choice did I have? I dragged myself up the hill to the Packers' cabin and stood on the porch. "Gabe," I said, "Tank's killing the fence." Gabe emerged in boxers, cowboy boots, and no socks or shirt. He strode past me and jogged down the field. I followed. "Hey," he said, "knock it off." He ran circles around the mules, whistling and waving his arms until he'd herded the whole team down the field. On his way back to the Packers' cabin, he passed me without a word. I should not have felt so terrible at not being able to control the mule team, but I did. Early the next morning, coffee in hand, I met Gabe at the barn where he'd hitched his horse Hercules to the fence and was tying boxes to the Decker pack saddle strapped to a mule. "Hey, I need you to babysit the mules today. I'm taking 5 head and Hercules, my horse. I'm leaving Dexter, Izzy, Earl, and Tank with you." Tank's ears perked up. "Yeah, Tank definitely respects my authority," I said. "Really, Gabe, how do you babysit a mule?" "They'll get restless without Hercules," he said. Mules, he explained, because of their confused identity, half donkey and half horse, were usually calm with their female horse around, but they would get nervous later in the day without her. "I can't," I said. "I'm afraid of Tank." "You'll be fine." He pointed to an aluminum bucket filled with oats. "It's their cake." His instructions were simple. I would let them out into the field at dusk. In the morning, I would hit an aluminum bucket with a trowel. I'm going to do a sound effect. The mules will know. It means they're getting their cake. They'll come running into the corral and you shut the gate. So I give them the cake. I don't give them the cake except tomorrow morning. That's right. Oh, they'll try to get you to. They'll start braying and screaming, but you can't give in. If they start screaming, ignore them. Okay, I could do that, except I must have looked concerned because Gabe added, you gotta be like a mule, don't give in. We walked the corral and I said their names. Dexter had a line down his back, Earl a white nose, Izzy was black, and Tank, well, I knew Tank, tall, dark, and handsome. I'm not sure what I did with my morning, but when I think about it now, I see myself daydreaming about Esther because part of what I did that summer was try to figure out why she lost her mind for a while. According to my mother, when Esther came home from the Christian Science Hospital, she seemed better, but then she fell into an even deeper pit. For my grandfather, there was no choice. He didn't know what else to do, my mother told me. He'd exhausted all his options. That's when he asked Esther to go to Orofino. During Esther's lifetime, Orofino was home to Idaho's second mental asylum, dubbed Idaho State Sanitarium, known today as Idaho State Hospital North. I have often crawled inside Esther's asylum days at Orofino, the white enamel walls, mechanical beds, and electric shock treatments. She had more than 20 of them. Esther detested electric shock as much as her namesake, Esther Greenwood, and Sylvia Plath, the bell jar. One of the many tortures of electric shock is memory loss. But Esther emerged from those shocks with a sharp recollection of the past and a steely resolve not to talk about it. It was the 100-mile car trip from St. Mary's to Orofino my mother remembered most. The little family of 3 drove over a mountain pass and headed down the Clearwater River. When they got to the asylum, my grandfather opened the door. I have envisioned him offering his hand to help Esther out of the car and seeing she was missing a shoe. Esther had thrown her shoe out the window somewhere along the way, my mother explained. Once we figured out what happened, I told Dad we'd better go back and get it. I said, Mom can't go into that place with one shoe. And that's what they did. That lone shoe in the ditch, a thing without its pair and therefore of no use, a parallel to Esther's own situation, lodged in my imagination. It's an image I've cherished. The shoe was Esther's way of resisting, of putting her foot down and stopping the moment, even if she couldn't halt the march of history. My mother's giving Esther the dignity of that shoe was the most tender act of love I could imagine. Mules don't forget, Gabe had said, and that makes them smart, sure-footed. I had always seen Esther as the most foot-sure, capable, sturdy person in my life. It was a revelation to know that these qualities may have come from her mental baggage. Maybe that's why she was cautiously drawn to mules. A passage in her memoirs details her interest in the creatures, how she once put her infant daughter in a ration box on one side of a mule, balanced on the other side with a load of lumber as she rode the steep trails along the Selway River, how she trusted the mule as much as she trusted herself. Early evening on the day I was babysitting the mules, I was on the airfield pulling pine saplings, nervously waiting for the animals to begin crying for their horse, for their cake, for who knows what else. And when they finally did, a sort of horse whinny that morphed into a donkey bray, I was actually relieved. I glanced toward the corral, swishing, stomping. I started hiking back to the station as the screaming grew louder and steadier. On the way, I noticed the cracked fence rails from Tank's shenanigans the night before. In the barn, I found a hammer, shovel, and a few stray nails in the dirt floor. Just then, an otherworldly sound rang through the compound, mournful and utterly primeval. I stepped out and Tank's head was hung along the corral fence, eyes glimmering. He screamed again. I cautiously approached the corral and he turned away. Though Gabe had told me that Tank broke fences because he thought the grass was always greener on the other side, I wondered then if there wasn't something more to it. What happened to you? I said. What makes you destroy fences? Scream. He angled his ears back as if he were going to snap at me, and then he went soft. Suddenly, I felt compelled to touch him. I put my hand on his massive neck, then rubbed it until his muscles relaxed a little. He kept his head on the fence, but he looked peaceful. Another mule whined. I made my rounds, stroking, talking softly, overwhelmed by their colossal strength and the ancient knowledge in their soft, dark eyes. Thank you.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah, if you want to unmute just to give Debbie a quick hand, that would be great. I'm sorry. Thank you so much, Debbie. That was lovely. Debbie and I reconnected at the Western Literature Association conference last fall that was held in Colorado. And I've been reading her book and really enjoying it. Just some lovely intersections of, you know, so many different threads going on. And it puts me back in Idaho. So we'll take questions at the end. I will mute everybody once Kathy starts reading. So next up is Kathryn Winograd. Kathryn Winograd is the author of Phantom Canyon, Essays of Reclamation, a finalist for the Forward Review's 2014 Indie Fab Book of the Year, Nonfiction Essays Award, and Air into Breath, which won the Colorado Book Award in Poetry. Her essays have been noted in Best American Essays and published in many journals and anthologies. Her poetry has received 3 Pushcart Prize nominations and a special mention in Pushcart Prize 38. She has been the recipient of a Colorado Artists Fellowship in Poetry, a Rocky Mountain Women's Institute Associateship, and a co-winner of a Colorado Endowment for the Humanities grant. She received her PhD in Literature and Creative Writing from University of Denver and an MFA in Poetry from University of Iowa. And as you'll hear when she reads, she divides her time between Littleton and a cabin off Phantom Canyon Road with her husband, a mutt named Joey, and a frou-frou poodle turned master hunter, Isabel. Please join me in welcoming Kathryn Winograd.
Thanks, Andrea. This is my book. If you can see it, it's Slow Arrow, Unearthing the Frail Children.
What happened to the sound?
Are we all able to hear? I can't hear anything.
All right, I screwed up. There you go. Can you hear me now? I screwed up. There you go. Okay, I got unmuted. Okay. My book, Slow Arrow, Unearthing the Frail Children, started originally as an impulse to explore the land that was up around Phantom Canyon, which is near Cripple Creek and Victor. I was interested in the mythology and the history and the geography. But what happened was that my mom ended up coming here about the same time I started working on this book. And she had come here to be with me. I was kind of honored that she wanted to spend her last years with me. My mother has been going blind and wanted me to help her as well. And I started taking her with me on these trips around the Phantom Canyon area. And so I began to realize that the outer landscape that I was exploring was so closely metaphoric to the inner landscapes that I was experiencing with my mother and my family. So the book is a series of these various trips that I took with my mother. This one I'm going to read is towards the end of the book. It's called Sky Glow. My husband made a telescope that's like 6 feet long many decades ago, and we go up at night and look at the stars all the time, and I've been trying to learn more about the stars. And so it became a braid of looking at the stars and trying to understand what sky glow was about and darkness, and then my mother, who is going blind. So this is Sky Glow. And I have picked out different parts of the chapter because I think I can't read the whole thing. Sometimes Leonard wakes me at 2 a.m. to watch the gibbous moon swallowed by Grouse Mountain. On winter nights, moonrise starts left of the butcher's abandoned camper trailer, where once this retired neighbor, vanished now, wiggled his 10 blocky fingers at me and said, 30 years and not a one lost. Leonard and I, too, are only temporary here, sporadic suburban migrants who will drive hours past slow rivers of fly fishermen, their fly lines like gossamer against the rocks, and then climb the deep shadows of Rainbow Pass to alight for a few days near the rim of the small canyon someone long ago named Phantom. That Indian princess, dark flower, it said, still heard weeping if we would only listen for her dead betrothed. According to the Bortle Dark Sky Scale, a chart created to quantify the effects of light pollution on the observability of celestial objects, the darkest sky measured at zenith, the most direct point over our heads, is ranked class 1. Theoretical, the editors at Sky and Telescope call this sky, an observer's nirvana. It seems that even at 9,600 feet altitude, even if our atmosphere were not a morass of human-made spill light and light trespass, the Earth itself lights the visible sky with air glow, planetary emissions. To hope to see the faint and the far-flung celestial objects in the night sky, one must learn the art of dark adaptation to quicken the sensitivity of the eye to the dim starlight that exists within this partial darkness. To hasten dark adoption, you must use what is called averted vision and look askance at the object so that its light hits the most sensitive area of the eye and thus becomes visible. The risk, though, is that the light might hit the blind spot where the optic nerve exits the eyeball, and then, as if you were blind, nothing of the object would be seen. Finally, light shuts, the last of it caught in the long, flat clouds at sunset that Mother calls weird. But now, 1 year after moving to Denver and years after my father's death, adds the word beautiful. I've never seen that before, she tells me, all that gold light held in the clouds. My mother watches the sky from a 9th floor apartment in the middle of this town turned bedroom of community to Denver. At night, the lighted townscape I sometimes watch with her is a tatting of shielded luminaires and pole mountings, a river of headlights, and an orange sky glow of illuminated baseball parks. The eastern sky from my mother's window is a class 7 on the Bortle scale, suburban-urban transition, where the whole background of the night sky is a dim white, the Milky Way, that collective star glow that Leonard and I gaze at in the thin air of our mountain cabin, nearly invisible. The 110 deep sky objects of French astronomer Messier recorded back in the 1800s with the equivalent of a child's toy telescope today have vanished from our sight. Pale ghost is how sky and telescope describes what is left to see in the class 7. Diffuse nebular, globular, and galactic clusters of stars nicknamed Andromeda, Butterfly, the Seven Sisters, and the Beehive Cluster. Its starlight 400 million years old and traveling 577 years to reach us, only to be dimmed by our excess light. Science also tells me that I can see 1900 quadrillion miles, that's 15 zeros tacked on after the 19, or a little more than 3,200 light years away. My mother peers out her window when I tell her this, and half-jokingly says that this is not quite what she can see. Low pressure glaucoma, macular degeneration. More and more, mother holds my arm, whether noon or dark. This is the real dark I always want to think. These 40 acres at night beneath our cabin balcony and its tiny shred of night light. The earth is an inky pitch here, unfathomable beneath this firmament I keep forgetting in the suburbs with my mother, sky glow and uplight dissembling the very stars our ancients once named into now truant gods. I am still trying to understand what a star is. I asked Lender what constellation in early winter will be most visible at the cabin. 2,300 years ago, Aristotle believed all heavenly bodies floating above our planet were perfect and everlasting. Even the asteroids of our solar systems that we know now as shattered worlds, imperfect fragments of the long vanished. Burnham's Celestial Handbook, an observer's guide that Leonard studied when he first took out his 6-foot-long telescope beneath the stars, is an old book now from its 1979 copyright, but it still tells me of the things I cannot see nor understand, of light years and radiant energy, of star clusters and dark gases, supergiants and red dwarf stars, and of the supernova, the complete destruction of a giant star, its luminosity equaling all of that of other billions of galactic stars out there. Somehow, despite Jung's admonishment that our whole purpose is to kindle meaning, this comforts me, this light in the dark that we cannot see. Orion, Leonard tells me, the constellation in our southwestern skies marked by 3 stars, the belt of Orion, that mythical hunter and celestial warrior of ancient Greece, lover of a king's daughter, I find out, who was struck blind by the king until the gods took pity on Orion and sent him to stand before the rising sun. His sight returned, everything I thought random not, I am now realizing, but connected to my mother. I think of my father, long dead, waiting for my mother in that small Midwestern Murdoch cemetery I wandered through as a child, and when I was a young girl waiting for love, honeysuckle pinned to the fence line between our farm and the toppled gravestones, and of the ashes one day I will gently carry there. I don't care, mother says, when I tell her what I want to do, I'll be gone. Of the 400 billion stars they say exist in the Milky Way, our galaxy thick with dark matter and the dust of the cosmos, I realize I can see not even a fraction, and of my mother, even less. I've been trying to remember that poem by Keats, I say to mother. She has been here almost a year and I sit companionably with her by our apartment window, that one about that star. Mother gets up from her chair before I'm even done talking, pulls out a hardbound book in a worn case from a mini bookcase, finds a page already bookmarked, and hands the book to me. Bright Star by John Keats. Next to the poem is a little penciled-in notation in my mother's handwriting. For Fanny Braun, the woman Keats loved and could not marry. The book, a little treasury of poetry. My mother gave this to me when I was 21. She knew I'd like to read poetry, mother says. I look at my mother. For over 50 years, I have written and studied poetry, and she has never once shared this book, nor her interest in poetry. Once I asked her about a personal journal of hers I had stumbled on and if she had written others. Oh, I had journals, she tells me, lots. But that's another life, another time. She jabs her thumb over her shoulder and chuckles. All gone. I lean my head back over the balcony railing to watch the motionless sky. Tramp stars the early Greeks called the wandering planets. The Babylonians read omens in the stars, beliefs for so long to be flawless and eternal. Minute by minute, the constellations that these early astronomers watched too drift westward, while these fragments of shattered worlds pass by us toward infinite space. I keep thinking of Keats, stargazer as my husband and I are, dying in a transient world. Keats believed that what the imagination seizes as beauty must be truth, whether it existed before or not. Billions of meteorites, fine as sand, spark against our air, and if I look long enough, I can track the unwavering pinheads of satellites and space stations beneath the stars. I ask myself what Keats would say now of this celestial clutter, thousands of satellites orbiting the Earth at 17,000 miles an hour, or of the cast-off nuts and bolts in the one lost glove of the astronomer, and of the uncannibal paint flecks and the plastic shards said to circle us in low Earth orbit. But then I remember that he believed it was the poet's quest to find beauty in a world doomed to suffering and death. Past midnight, the moon will again circle over Nipple Mountain, where an ancient hibernating bear will rouse itself in spring into the crosshairs of a spotting scope owned by Dave, leaser of Fields, who has trained his telescope on this lair for so many years to watch this slow awakening. Mythic, we call it now. Then finally the moon will descend to moonset. So slowly it seems, our eyes heavy with sleep, Leonard's body and mine trembling together against the jagged frosted air until the mountain snags it and we watch a moon so beautiful that even my mother can see it plummet past the visible edge. I try not to seem too greedy now and leaf nonchalantly through the little slips of paper my mother has folded up and tucked into the front cover of her little treasury of poetry book. A poem written by my grandmother to my mother on her 21st birthday. Poems on loneliness, one by an ancient Chinese poet, and a French love poem translated by my father 2 years before he married my mother, with a little postscript he wrote at the end, P.S. French. On the back of the poem, my mother typed in the English translation so long ago that I can barely make out the letters where the page folds. Well, mother says, your father was barely passing French, so I had to do something. Mother and I laugh. Amour, my father signed. 12 times now the moon has orbited the earth since my mother moved here, or 13 if the blue moon, the betrayer moon, rose even once, that bitter Lenten moon of repentance, of reflection I had once forgotten. I think of my mother at her city window, this tiny widow who once carried me, waiting to be led through the darkness, and of Sothis, guide I'd never heard of, goddess of Sirius, of the brightest star I can see beneath Orion, guiding the dead to an afterworld I once knew nothing of. Its stars, once thought imperishable, faded and shattered, but still beautiful. To our eyes that must dark adapt, the moon is the amorphous stone, the light casts into scythe and disk. This earthly world in the moon's marble casts, etoliated except when sometimes spill light from an open window or a suburban garage, or a faded letter dyes the winter leaves of the old roses green. In the darkest of skies, theoretical or not, mother, here are the words for light I can give you. Effulgence, meaning a shining forth, or incandescence, the emissions of visible light by a body, or finally, luminescence, all that gold light we can see, like a husband's, or a father's, or now a mother's, which does not need the body's heat to warm us. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kathy. That was lovely, and I really enjoyed the winding back and forth between poetry and science. So at this point, I'd like to open it up for questions. If anyone has a few questions, I've seen lots of comments sort of on lines people enjoyed or whatever, but I don't know, does anyone have any questions about the process or how these books came to be or what DJ and Kathy are focusing on now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I have a couple questions. Okay. Any tips on weaving the narrative? Because you both do it so well. So if each of you,
DJ, you want to go first?
Sure, I can. I wish I could share the screen with you because I would show you how I wove all the, my whole book is woven pieces like mules and mental illness. So I actually did it literally, and I took photos of it. I would kind of get a hunch about how two things maybe work together. I have another chapter in my books on parachutes and my grandmother's death. And my grandfather was obsessed with parachutes and airplanes. And so I would kind of get a hunch about how these things, you know, two kind of opposite things, or maybe not opposite, but they wouldn't quite go together, how they might intersect, but they would have to intersect naturally or organically. Like I couldn't force them too much. And then I would just write a whole bunch, put it away, think about it, and then I would start chopping up that writing and just kind of looking at it for maybe like a week on this table right back here. And so, and trying to find that common, with the Venn diagram, just that overlap. Like, what is the overlap? Well, in this piece, it was being foot sure and having mental baggage. I kind of had a sense, because my grandmother did like mules, I had a sense there was something in that. And then I would try to dig into both stories and see where that overlap was. So that's how I do it. I think there are a lot of different ways, and I must say that, Andrea, you are also a master at weaving narratives into a piece. I remember your piece about the wolves. You have another essay about river rafting, and you could probably answer this question better than anybody.
Thank you.
So when this book, weaving it was a little different process than I've done in the past, and it was more difficult. Usually I start writing and then the threads become apparent to me, and then I just start working with each one and going back and forth as I'm writing, because I find it so interesting to see the kind of meaning that comes out of unexpected juxtaposition. This book was a little bit harder because I had really written the essays originally for a journalism site online, and it was about really environmental issues and the beauty of nature. But I knew when I wrote those, I had left these little places in there where I knew that there was something more going on, that there was a chance for metaphor. And so when I went back to them, then I started going back to those places and realizing what for me was the family, the personal thread that went through it. If you haven't done it before, it is a really fascinating way to write. I think it's exciting, and you never know what you're going to discover. And I think it, for me, I had a sense of depth every time that I start weaving a piece. And I will also say another thing I did in this comes from, now I'm forgetting the poet laureate, Natalie, famous, credible poet. Someone help me out.
Trethewey?
Yes, thank you, Trethewey. Yeah, she came to Ashland when I was teaching there, and she told me this just a wonderful story about really of going and looking for the gaps behind what is like understood history, but looking for those gaps. And so where I live, it seems, it's beautiful, but I mean, it is a lot of high meadow, mountain meadow. But as soon as you start digging into the geography, the history, the science, the mythology, it's amazing what you find and how those pieces become so ripe for metaphor in what you read and what you write.
Well, I think, well, two things. About DJ, I loved your vulnerability and writing about essentially a sanity. And, who has it, who doesn't. Do families, trade it back and forth and that kind of thing. So I really like that.
Me too.
And I thought you were brave in writing it and in reading it. Kathy, I have no idea what's going to come out of her mouth. Because, I mean, she can be talking about stars at one moment and love and daughters at the next moment. And you don't know what's coming. And with Kathy, it seems to me, and I sort of never know if it's a poem or it's a piece of prose, which is cool and fine, But the incantation of the way you read it sounds to me at one point like a poem and one point like a piece of prose. But those were both lovely, I thought. So thank you.
Thanks.
Debbie,
Thank you so much, Marty. That was really touching to hear that.
Debbie, in the last 30 years that I've known you, in our discussions, I've listened to you make these kind of connections and weave together these stories and connections, and it is so gratifying to hear that in this reading you gave today, in your book. How you've perfected that. It's a wonderful skill you have, and I really enjoyed your reading.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. This is a wonderful conversation. It looks like there's another conversation that's been going on in the chat about, how do you get that balance, weaving back and forth. I had a question about that just sort of came up as Marty was talking, and I realized both of you, have a lot of family members in your work, and and living people. And I was interested in sort of how you've navigated that. Debbie, it sounds like you gave a partial answer to that. Yeah, I just sort of wanted to hear on that.
Kathy, why don't you go ahead now?
Okay. Well, it was interesting hearing what you said about thinking that your mother wasn't quite ready to hear this book. I wrote a collection of essays before this one called Phantom Canyon, Essays of Reclamation. And I wrote about something that had happened when I was much younger, and it was very hard for me to write. And I was worried about showing it to my mother, but to be honest, I thought, well, you know, she's thousands of miles away. I'm not going to worry about it. And then she moves, and she's 7 minutes away when the book came out. And so that was hard. But, you know, my mom was pretty wonderful. She said, you know, I was wondering what your book was about because you hadn't said anything. And so I said, well, this is what it's about, Mom. I'm giving you this copy. And then I didn't hear from her for a few days. And she came back and she said something so lovely. She said that the book was beautiful, even the hard parts. And so I appreciated that greatly. I think that Scott Russell Sanders is someone who I respect so much as a nonfiction writer. And he talks about, you know, treating those you write about with grace and dignity. And even if you're writing about something difficult, doing so with the thought of trying to understand. I mean, not to judge, but to understand and to make some kind of peace and connection. And so I think that's what I try to do.
Oh, it's very striking, the Rocky Mountain states, the mountain landscapes in which you've both written about, the animals, the mules that bore the Hayden expedition to the peaks where they're surveying the mountainside, these places of refuge. You've written about, both of you, so eloquently. Thank you.
Yeah, Andrea said that it would be great to read with DJ because she felt like there was a lot of synergies in our work, and I absolutely hear that. And I'm really honored to have read with DJ.
Yeah, I agree, and I really love looking at the night sky myself. So I was just, you know, basking in your prose. But thank you so much, Greg. That's nice. It's hard landscape, this Rocky Mountain landscape. It's hard for a lot of reasons. I mean, physically it's hard, but it also has the colonial settler history. It has, you know, the Dust Bowl history. It has, you know, the Oregon Trail. It has, you know, many gender issues. But it's also just hard to be there physically, especially as a small woman, you know, tromping through a wilderness for 50 miles with a 50-pound pack. It's hard. So you know, negotiating all of those different fault lines was, you know, a major whatever obstacle for me anyway. But thank you for recognizing that.
Can I ask a quick question? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, I wanted to ask DJ a quick question about research. And you just alluded to some of it in terms of your travel through the backcountry with a 50-pound pack, and also it came up in my mind listening to you talk about your experience in the middle of the night with the mules, a mule named Tank, and then the mule handler. What was his name?
Gabe. That actually isn't his real name because he's now a ranch manager for a very famous media person whom all of you guys would recognize and have seen many, many times. So I didn't want to give his real name and, you know, sort of out him. But yeah, Gabe. Gabe's his book name.
So it comes out in his boxers and his cowboy boots, and he's just probably sleepy. And anyway, you know, he's probably a little impatient. And anyway, it's clear that you're, somebody mentioned your vulnerability there, which I thought was cool, is really what helped make the scene. But also, how do you do that kind of research where you're clearly not a part of that world? You don't know the first thing about handling mules, which you make clear. And I got the feeling that you probably weren't an experienced backpacker either, though that's likely different now. But how do you it just seems to me to take a lot of courage to sort of throw yourself into that environment where you don't know anything. And how do you get past that?
Well, it was because I was, you know, I'd been a professor at WSU for probably 12 years by then, and I was very confident in, which interestingly, Kathy, my original field is British Romantic poetry, and I've written like lots of articles on John Keats. So, you know, I had this real like, oh, well, I'm just going to find out everything from books. And so I read a lot, but then once you get out there, like Western Mule magazine, I had no idea there was a whole magazine devoted to mules, and that there were people out there that read this thing, you know, with great interest. And so I did have to just make myself like just be okay with not knowing anything. But I felt really, you know, in my early 40s, I think I would have fit, if I were in my 20s, it would have been easier. But in my early 40s, I had to just become this person who didn't know anything. And I was humiliated a lot. I had to live with being humiliated a lot. So I think that's probably a good lesson for anybody who wants to write about something that they don't know. And you just have to be willing to ask stupid questions and look, you know, just look like a fool a lot and be okay with that. That's a great question, Peter. Thank you.
I just want to ask Joni, she had a question about setting. Did you feel like that got answered, or?
A little bit, but I'll ask it anyway to see if anybody has anything else they want to say about it. I wanted to know how you guys used setting as a tool to tell the story, because you both use it differently, and I was interested to know how you thought that helped the story that you were telling.
I ended up using setting as a lot for metaphor. There's another essay in this book, which I go down to. There's Florissant National Park near where our cabin is, and there used to be a volcano there. The very first fossilized butterfly impression of a butterfly was found there. There's carbon. It's known for its carbon imprints of leaves and plants and nuts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You go down, you think that there's, you know, it's just kind of this beautiful open field with mountains ringing it. But once you start to do research into it, and for me, I think the research is the fun part, just to kind of see, just to kind of Google along and see what you find out. And you find, you know, you start to find these connections. The essay ended up being about my father's death. And there was this one image that I kept coming to me after seeing these beautiful, it's like shale, like it's slabs, and then you have this carbon imprint in it. But there was my father ended up with Alzheimer's and had really a terrible death, and he ended up being in a hospital ward. And my brother told me a story about going to visit him, and then my brother's leaving, and my father was following him to go out the door, which he wasn't allowed to go out, and the door closed, and my brother saw my father's face pressed against the glass. And so for me, that just, the connection there, the inner and the outer landscape really became so powerful for me at that point.
Wow.
Yeah. When I first started writing about the Selway Bitterroot, I grew up in cities. I grew up in Seattle and lived in London for a while, and Calgary. And so when I first started writing, I just kind of resorted to this guidebook, you know, brochure type language, like the beautiful, you know, peaks and valleys. Like it took me a while to get that kind of setting language that's kind of handed down to us out of my out of my head. And I did also find that a little setting goes a long ways, that long descriptions of setting, unless they're tied to character development or to, like Kathy was saying, to the metaphorical meaning or to the, the plot somehow, that, try to stay away from those long passages of setting, even though they're so fun to write when you're traveling in a place that's like a wilderness, or like Kathy, Under the Night Sky. I mean, you just want to gush about it for forever. But I had to scale back a lot of my setting descriptions, even though setting is like one of the main points of my book. So I tried to always make it tied to character or the plot. Yeah.
I think you brought up two interesting things to me. Is that one, I feel like setting becomes important as you become part of the setting. Like when you are new to a place, you do kind of resort, you don't know it. And it's when you're living there and it kind of seeps into you and you start to feel it inside you that you start to realize kind of its metaphoric possibilities. And Kim Barnes is out in Oregon. Is that right? Do you know Kim Barnes? Yeah. I mean, and I remember she came out to Ashland and she talked about, and this is something to think about for those who are writing or thinking about writing crib nonfiction, is to become a tour guide in your own area, to use the field guides to learn the names of plants and the bushes and what's around you, because that language is certainly probably better than the beautiful tall mountains, right, that you see out there. So
thank you. Yeah, Kim's teaches at University of Idaho, which is the twin university to Washington State. Jamil had a question. Jamil, are you on? Okay. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thanks, Andrea. Thank you so much, Kathryn and DJ. Wonderful way to end the week. I thought of a question for you, Kathryn. First of all, thank you for your office. But secondly,
you got the best view of the whole school.
I see where you got the inspiration. So started there. No, not. But I loved your. It's always a feat, isn't it, to make metaphors, because by definition you got two unlike things and you build this bridge. But you mentioned Keats and maybe DJ, you can respond to this too. I instantly thought of, as many do, right, negative capability, and this Keats's his realization that so much of what it means to be a human being is to live with uncertainty, right? And to be okay with that, and to be able to still experience beauty and truth without necessarily a scientific or logical framework. And so I just wanted to ask you, to what extent did negative capability and even your own version of it inform your metaphorical bridging?
I think Keats became a part of that essay I just read because literally my mom did pull out this book when I asked this question and was scurrying around, and it just shocked me so much. And then I started thinking about Keats more, and then of course he was a stargazer as well. And there's such a beauty in the landscape around us. There's such a beauty with my mother, but there's such uncertainty too. And there's such sadness and there's such darkness there at times. I mean, what I read is really a culminating essay that comes after my mom had a very difficult adjustment here. So, if I think of negative capability, it's, accepting that there is beauty, that even after death, there will be memory, there will be this light that will still appear when I think of my mother and father. So I see what you're getting at.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, that's that I was thinking of that line or that little quote from his letters to his brother and sister-in-law when you were reading, when you were reading, Kathy, about Keats. That line, it's interesting. I've known that that quotation for like 25 years, and the part that always intrigues me is when he says, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. So the negative capability is being, you know, at peace with the contradictions without the irritable. And I think about that word a lot, especially now. I mean, what would he have done if he would have had the internet, you know, and Google? Because there is a weird irritation that that constant access to knowledge, you know, what we think of as knowledge, which is fact, you know, that you can get online on Wikipedia or whatever. And there is, you know, irritation registers in the body at this gut level, right? And I don't know. And I think in the writing process, that irritation can creep in where you think, oh, I have to know this in order to write about it, when writing itself provides its own discovery process. And when you can just like ignore that irritable reaching after fact and reason and let writing itself be the discovery, I think that's like a really sweet place to be. And I am not there nearly as much as I would love to be. But thank you for that question, Jamey. That was wonderful.
No problem, my pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, great. And I think in the interest of time, we'll just wind up. That was such a great discussion at the end. So I guess if you have further questions, I can put their websites up, and it gives ways to get in touch with them. And then you had the link earlier about where to buy their book. So Jamey is going to make a quick announcement now.
Oh, thanks. Thank you so much to DJ and to Kathy. Loved the reading tonight and as well the discussion. So thank you all both very much. Just wanted to let the audience know here who are interested in Progenitor that we actually are still having a Progenitor, and it's going to be a really excellent issue. It's Progenitor number 55. Of course, we cannot have our release party that we normally have in early May. We hope to have that release party in mid to late August, the beginning of the fall semester. And so we'll be having a live event and handing out books at that point. So I just wanted to mention that. And again, thank you. And thanks to Andrea for hosting. Thanks to everyone for joining us as well.
Thanks so much. So Progenitor is our land escapes. And yeah, thank you so much. Let's everybody, if you want to unmute, and let's give DJ and Kathy a hand.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. And
thank you.
Thank you, Debbie.
Yeah, thanks, Dwayne. Talk to you soon.
Yes.
Bye, Andrea.
Bye, Debbie.
Hey, Chris.
Bye.